Democrats will look to regain a majority in the House of Representatives this November, and they can take a major step towards doing so on June 5th, when primary voters in California head to the polls. As part of our Local Matters series, we're taking an inside look at pivotal races in the state. Democrats need to keep all their House seats and flip 23 additional seats from red to blue. Progressive candidates are expected to be competitive for several Republican-held seats in California in the midterm elections. Seema Mehta is a political writer for the Los Angeles Times, and she joins me now from L.A. Seema, thanks for being with us. What kind of messaging have we seen from progressive House candidates in California?
I think progressive House candidates in California are really trying to tie their Republican rivals to President Trump in the hopes of, some of these Republican members of Congress have represented their districts for so long. They have long-time relationships with their voters. Voters have sent them back to the House over and over again, but they're hoping that the voters who in 2016 turned against President Trump will start to see these members of Congress through that lens as supporting President Trump's agenda.
And so does this approach from Democrats line up with the issues important to California voters?
I think in part it does, in part it doesn't. And we've seen this in contests across the nation. When Democrats have just focused on an anti-Trump message, they haven't been as successful as when they've had candidates who really connect with voters on the issues that matter in their district. So I think that these candidates are really trying to walk a fine line. But you have a number of issues in California that you're not necessarily talking about in the rest of the country. I mean, some of the things that you hear on the campaign trail include housing inaffordability, homelessness, the idea that their children can't have the lives that they had, that the golden dream is sort of dead. And you hear this on both sides of the aisle, actually, although obviously they have very different solutions to it.
All right. Now, so homelessness, what are some of the other big issues? I'm curious, obviously we're not from California.
Sure.
Most of our viewers may not be from California.
Sure.
So tell us, what are the biggest issues facing the state?
I mean, the state's almost like a tale of two states because it has like an economy that's roaring. It's now the 5th largest economy in the world. Yet there are large numbers of people that have really been left behind, whose wages have stagnated, who are not able to keep up with the cost of living, who can no longer afford to buy a house, who have to work multiple jobs. So there's really, like the wealthy are doing really, really well, but people who are, middle class, working class are not doing quite as well. So that's a major issue. Homelessness has just skyrocketed across the state. I mean, there are parts of Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego that it looks like nothing like it did 10 years ago. So that's a major issue in some of the cities. And then just the idea, housing has just gotten increasingly expensive. It's always been expensive, but even more so. So just that idea that I mentioned before, that people are often talking about their children not being able to keep on living in California, to not be able to achieve the same sort of lifestyle that they were able to achieve 30, 40 years ago. And a concern that the opportunities presented here are not really available for everybody anymore.
And California's top 2 primary system means the top 2 candidates, regardless of party, advance to the general election. So what kinds of problems can that create for both parties when voters go to the polls?
Right. It has created problems for both parties. I mean, obviously, California is an overwhelmingly Democratic state. In 2016, we had the first open Senate contest we've had in more than 2 decades. Everyone expected this really exciting race. But what ended up happening was in the primary, you had 2 relatively well-known Democrats and 3 little-known Republicans running. The Republicans didn't have any money. They really couldn't get their message out on the airwaves. And so Republican voters didn't have a lot of information about them and splintered, between the 3 of them, leaving the 2 Democrats to move on to the general election. And that was sort of a blow to the party to not have a candidate in this marquee race. And then 2018, there's the risk of the same thing happening again in both the governor's race and the Senate race. And there's an extra wrinkle this time around because we have all these competitive congressional races in California where for Republicans it's really important to drive turnout, and they believe, a lot of people believe having candidates at the top of the ticket drives turnout. And if Republicans don't have a candidate at the top of the ticket, that could depress turnout and sort of perhaps give an edge to Democrats. On the flip side of that, you have some congressional seats where there are just such large fields of candidates where there's so many Democrats running that Democrats might splinter, and you might have 2 Republicans move on to the general election, which would take away an opportunity for Democrats to gain control of more seats in this, that they need to regain control of Congress.
Now, earlier there you mentioned the governor's race. I want to talk about that for a moment. A poll from last month showed Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom with a big lead in the governor's race. Where does most of Newsom's support come from, and what are his main campaign issues?
Sure. He has tried to position himself as the most liberal Democrat who's running. For example, he's in support of single-payer health care. He's taken the side of teachers unions as opposed to ed reformers. And he's sort of pointed to his history, whether it was, doing the first gay marriages in San Francisco more than a decade ago, enacting sort of a version of universal health care with limits in the city of San Francisco many years ago when he was mayor, to argue that he's the most liberal candidate, and also he's taken the most risks, that he's been willing to take risks even when it wasn't popular. He's also done measures, to support recreational marijuana, to increase the state's gun control laws. So he's been, sort of out there on these issues. And he does get a lot of support from liberals. He's backed by a lot of unions, not all of them though, but his main Democratic rival is Antonio Villaraigosa, and he's the former mayor of Los Angeles, and he's trying to sort of pit himself as a Democrat certainly, but as a more centrist Democrat, a more moderate Democrat, a more pragmatic Democrat, saying that he's for single payer, but we have to figure out how to pay for it before we go there. That it's super expensive right now, and we don't know how to do it. And it sort of pits up this, it creates this sort of classic Northern California, Southern California battle. You also have two Republicans who are running, John Cox and Travis Allen, and both of them are trying really hard to consolidate support so that one of them can make it past June. But that's a real question if one of them will be able to, given they don't have quite as much money and they aren't as well known as their Democratic rivals.
Well, picking up again on the issue of what's important to California voters, President Trump met with California leaders and public officials on the subject of the so-called sanctuary cities on Wednesday. So how important is that issue to the voters in your state, or is it all about economics, as you mentioned earlier?
No, that's certainly an issue in the state. And I mean, so, Democrats, in reaction to the Trump administration's actions on immigration, Democrats in Sacramento, tried to enact some additional protections for people who live in California who are in the country illegally. There's been a huge backlash, against that, particularly in places like Orange County, which are traditionally red places, but which these competitive, congressional races that we talked about earlier are unfolding in. And Republicans are sort of seizing upon this. They hope to create energy and momentum for their candidates. And in some ways, if you listen to strategists, you hear that, that there is some success there, that there's a feeling that perhaps the Democrats have overreached. But that said, Democrats in California are certainly standing their ground in terms of the actions they've took and trying to continue to hold themselves up as the resistance against the Trump administration.
And of course, as you mentioned earlier, California has a large Hispanic population, which I'm sure will factor into these races as well. All right. Well, Seema Mehta, thank you so much.
Thank you.